So I'm kind of starting this this talk in a way from the other end. This is a slide of the Swiss pavilion in the 1937 exhibition in Paris, the famous international exhibition where Picasso showed Guernica, and where the Soviet and the German pavilions kind of glowered at one another. But here we can see that the Swiss pavilion looks very kind of crisp and neat and modern. Now, the thing about Switzerland is that it's, I guess, like all countries, a mass of contradictions, and in some respects Switzerland was and is very modern, and in other respects it's quite old-fashioned. I mean, for instance, women didn't get the vote in Switzerland until 1971, and in fact one of the cantons, the smallest canton, didn't get the vote till 1990. So there are these kind of interesting currents of modernism and its reverse. So this exhibition was 1937, and of course this was also the year of the notorious Degenerate Art exhibition in Germany. And many of the objects that were on show during that exhibition, these were paintings and sculptures and drawings and prints that were taken out of museums in Germany, are basically confiscated from museums because they were seen to be degenerate because of Jewish and Bolshevik influence. But the Nazi hierarchy wasn't above making a bit of money out of them, and so many of them were then shipped to Switzerland, and there was a grand auction in 1939 at the Grand Hotel in Lucerne, where a large number of paintings, including Franz Marc's Three Red Horses, Gauguin's Landscape of Tahiti with three female tigers, Picasso's The Harlequins, and a self-portrait by Paula Modersohn-Baker. And there were loads of others, paintings, 15 paintings by Lovis Corinth, 9 by Oskar Kokoschka, 7 by Emil Nolde. So there was lots of this stuff. Interestingly, the auction itself wasn't actually that well attended because people were in kind of two minds about it. People felt that they needed to rescue the paintings, but on the other hand, they didn't want the money to go to prop up the Nazis. So again, some interesting tensions. So now I'm going to whiz back to the end of the 19th century, and the artist who was considered to be the sort of greatest living Swiss artist at that time, and that was Ferdinand Hodler. And this is one of his most celebrated paintings, and it's called The Night. And in the center of the painting, you can see this is Hodler himself being woken up by death. And this is his mistress on one side here, asleep. He was very much involved with what was the kind of international, how would you describe it? It's almost like the international style of the period, really, which was symbolism. Now, symbolism is a very kind of shapeless kind of movement, and it covers all kinds of stuff, and particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, it had a very strong kind of nationalist element to it. In Hodler's work, there is some of that, but there's also this sense in which he's presenting imagery in an almost a kind of modern icon form. You can see how stylized the space is in which these figures are lying. I mean, they're very realistic figures, but the space they're occupying is much more stylized. Now, this is a painting of his, which is called Jena Students Depart for the War of Liberation of 1813. Now, this is an incident from German history. This is towards the end of the Napoleonic Wars, where the tide of the war was running against Napoleon, and there was a second battle at Jena, and these are the students who are going off to fight in it. Now, the reason I put this painting in, because you think, well, what's it got to do with Switzerland? Well, I chose it really because the painting itself had an afterlife. And this is a painting by the Soviet socialist realist artist Alexander Deinecker. This was painted in 1928, and it's called The Defense of Petrograd. So obviously this is going back now to the days of the Russian Revolution. But obviously he knew the painting by Hodler, and this was strongly influenced by that painting. So Hodler he was well known across Europe. He wasn't a parochial artist. Puvis de Chavannes in France considered him a colleague. And here's another one of his paintings. This one is called Youth Admired by Women, dated in 1904, and the youth is actually his son. And again, we've got the same thing of, I mean, the figures are realistic, but obviously their poses are very kind of stylized. But you could almost say that the three women are frozen in almost like dance positions. And this is the portrait of his mistress on her deathbed, Valentine Godet d'Orel. And he painted and drew over 100 pictures while she was dying. So obviously she was very important to him, but nevertheless, this protracted death provided him with a big exhibition of pretty heavy work, but it kind of fits very much in with a lot of the ideas that symbolism was to do with. I mean, there were kind of, you could argue maybe there were two main sort of strands within the sort of Western tradition of symbolism, one of which was to do with the kind of metaphysical, beyond the physical plane kind of thing, while I think Hodler was much more of a kind of, I don't think there's much mysticism involved with in his work, except in the sense of glorifying in what happens to matter and what happens in space and what happens in the landscape. I mean, in his youth, I mean, he came from a very ordinary background, and in fact trained to start with as a decorative artist, but his talent was spotted, and he then was taught how to draw, and his teacher was a very realistic artist, and ensured that Hodler drew. And in fact, at Hodler's death, there were actually thousands of sketchbooks, and he drew constantly. And this is another Swiss symbolist, and if any of you have been in the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool, you may recognize this painting, because that's where it is, and it was bought from him back in the day. The painting is called The Punishment of Lust, sometimes called The Punishment of Luxury, painted in 1891. And Segantini has the most remarkable kind of life story. I mean, he was he was an absolute nobody. Came up as an orphan. He was brought up by his mother to begin with, who lived in terrible poverty, and she was had to spend most of her time sort of working in menial jobs. She moved away to Milan, and after a while, I mean, and being in Milan, she didn't do anything about their nationality. And in fact, for the rest of his life, Segantini was a stateless person. But again, because it was noted that he could draw, he was picked up at the age of 7. He ran away and was found living on the streets in Milan. The police put him into a reformatory, and that's where he learned basic cobbling skills. But a chaplain at the reformatory noticed that he could draw, and then encouraged him to continue with this. And then eventually a half-brother claimed him from the reformatory, and he ran a photographic studio. So there's this sort of gradual moving up the scale until he came to the Brera Academy. And quite quickly, he began to make a reputation for himself, and was earning money, and became quite well-to-do. So we'll move on to another, the next painting.
That's that thing, yeah.
Hang on, let's mute. Now, to begin with, he was very much in the tradition of the symbolists, as we saw in that last painting, doing kind of allegorical paintings sort of strongly based on sort of literature and myth. But this painting shows a different move. This is where he became infected, if you like, by the latest fashion, which was obviously coming out of France, which was kind of post-impressionist divisionism, and using colour in a much sort of sharper way, so putting down pure strokes of colour. Obviously, he's not doing it in the same way as Seurat. He tends to use kind of fine lines to build up his painting. Now, the sad thing about Segantini is that he died very young, and what he would have gone on to, of course, is a matter of conjecture. But he nevertheless had an influence, and combined with the influence of, this is another painting by Hodler, and you can see very kind of simplified, almost sort of abstract representation of mountains. This is the Berggipfel in the morning light. So think of these sort of kind of two influences: Segantini's kind of divisionism and Hodler's symbolism. And hey presto, we get Kuno Amier, another Swiss
the volume that needs to go up,
artist, with who again had some interesting connections. He was a friend, befriended Paul Klee. He was also a very close friend of Alberto Giacometti's father, Giovanni Giacometti. So this painting, we've got again this kind of, is it a real space, or is it a sort of symbolic space? Again, we've got this figure that's dwarfed by the immensity of the landscape and of the snow. So symbolism is still alive and well. I mean, symbolism, maybe I should attempt some kind of a definition. Symbolism really is more to do with alluding to things rather than kind of presenting you with symbols. The idea is that paintings kind of suggest things to you, which is why, again, in Central and Eastern Europe, the kind of nationalistic approach worked well with it, because you could allude to kind of national feeling with careful, judicious use of imagery. Now, this is one of Giovanni Giacometti's paintings. And obviously, we've kind of moved on somewhat now. This is called Vue de Capoluogo, and this is painted in 1907. So we're sort of 2 years after the famous Cage aux Fauves at the Salon d'Automne in Paris. So those ideas of working in strong colour, working in a relatively kind of simplified, even crude manner, you know, the ideas were out there, and Giovanni Giacometti was up for it. And this is Cuno Amier again, and this is a self-portrait with Apple. So once more, we're seeing this sort of synthesis of symbolism and the kind of more modernist application of paint. And another painting by him, portrait of Gertrude Müller, called The Violet Hat, which is a wonderful painting. Again, if you compare it with something like Matisse's Blue Stripe, it's much kind of tighter and more formalized. You know, it's very much kind of locked in with that blue line. So there's a kind. He's very reliant upon line. Almost, I mean, I almost feel that the line kind of overpowers it a bit. It tends to make the face a bit flat, doesn't it? But, let's move on. And this painting is a little portrait, also by Cuno Amier, of Alberto Giacometti when he was a boy. So he grew up in an artistic milieu. I mean, you know, it was inevitable that that he was going to be an artist. And now we're going on to a rather roguish figure. This is Félix Vallotton, who was Swiss. He actually became a French citizen in 1900. But I thought we could look at some of his paintings nevertheless. He was, I mean, in France, he was a bit of a one-off. There wasn't really anyone who painted quite like him. He was involved with the Nabby. There was with Vuillard and Bonnard at the end of the 19th century. In fact, he made his name first and foremost as a printmaker. He did a lot of black and white prints, many of them highly satirical. In fact, he was a contributor to an anarchist magazine at that time. But this painting is called Naked Woman Fondling a Silenus, painted in 1907. And this is in the Museum of Beaux-Arts in Lausanne in Switzerland. There is a lot of wry humor in Vallotton's work. Also, around 1900, he, despite his apparent anarchist tendencies, he married a very wealthy heiress, and so he didn't have to worry about selling his work, although he did, and he didn't really belong to any particular movement. So he painted to please himself, and this is a painting called The Rape of Europa, painted in 1908. There was an exhibition at the Royal Academy last year of his work, which was really interesting. I mean, his nudes should we say, they vary in quality, definitely. But this one is quite fun. I mean, I'm not sure whether it's really the rape of Europa or Europa making her escape. And this was probably, in my opinion anyway, was the finest painting in the Vallotton exhibition at the RA. Again, he's obviously making some interesting points here. It's called La Blanche et la Noire. and this one's in the Kunstmuseum in Winterthur. So what could we say about this painting? It's a kind of inverse, really, of Manet's Olympia. So we don't have a black maid, dutifully coming along with a little bunch of flowers. Here we've got one who's having a smoke break and looking at this girl and thinking, so what? And back to another Giovanni Giacometti, where his paint is really breaking up now, becoming much more fauvist. This was painted in 1910, roundabout. It's just simply called Three Figures. Now, of course, one of the massive influences, particularly in sort of Holland, Germany, and Switzerland, were the two figures of Van Gogh and Gauguin. So we can perhaps see both in this painting, but probably mostly Van Gogh. And then we come to the very interesting case of Alice Bailey, who I should think is almost completely unknown in this country, but quite a significant Swiss artist, and one that has a particularly interesting career. And this is one of her paintings, just simply called Three Female Torsos, and painted in 1907. And this one obviously shows that she's been looking at the way in which Van Gogh puts on his brush marks. Compositionally, and maybe in terms of subject matter and the kind of presentation, the way which is used line, you could say there's still a strong link with the turn of the century symbolism. It took a while for that to fizzle out. And this is another one of her paintings called The Archers. And this is painted on sackcloth. And again, whether that was because she'd seen paintings by Gauguin that were done in that way. And of course, what we're seeing now in this painting is futurism. We're seeing that she's obviously been looking at artists who are using and showing movement in their paintings. Now, she spent a lot of time in Paris. She went to Paris. She was a very energetic, very sociable woman. She got to know lots of the avant-garde artists at the time, and visited the studios and picked up lots of ideas. And here we have another kind of amalgam, really, of Cubism and Futurism. Now, if she were a Russian, we might say that this was Cubo-Futurism. There were a lot of Russian artists in Paris at this time, and particularly women artists. And when they went back to Russia, they brought back this kind of hybrid Cubo-Futurism. Now, the Cubists and the Futurists tended to view one another with great suspicion, and there were lots of quite heated debates between them. But for artists who were outside of France, didn't really see what there was to argue about. There were ideas to be had and syntheses to be made, and obviously Alice Bailey was one of those artists. Now, from what I read about her, she was obviously a very, very energetic and very enthusiastic, and also had this sense of wanting to kind of keep up with what was going on. And this is a painting of her sister, Louisa Bailey, which is called Woman with a Fan. So again, we've got, is it a futurist painting? Is it a cubist painting? Or is it, maybe it's neither of those things. Maybe she has now successfully synthesized this into her own particular manner. And this is really interesting composition. This one is the Geneva Harbour or Flight of Seagulls. You can see she's kind of created this elliptical kind of composition within the rectangle. So again, I guess you could say that she's taken things from futurism, but obviously we're now kind of moving into a much closer to kind of an abstract approach to putting a painting together. I mean, here this sort of disc at the bottom, I guess you could say perhaps this is the focal point of the painting. It also acts as a kind of weight to this ellipse. And compositionally, it's really interesting and intriguing thing. Move on to the next slide. Now this one, I have to admit to some ignorance over why she painted this. The painting is called The Battle of Tolochenaz. I'm probably mispronouncing that. Tolochenaz, perhaps, painted in 1916. Now, obviously, this is during the First World War, but Tolochenaz is a tiny and very picturesque village in Switzerland, miles away from the wall. So I think my theory is that it was around this time that she was getting to know some of the people who were escaping from the madness of the war, and she was getting involved with the artists who were the Dadaists. She got to know Jean Arc, and in particular, she got to know Francis Picabia. So I think that this painting is basically a kind of Mickey take. That, and here we have the Swiss flag at the top. Over here, it looks as if we've got a German flag, and this looks like a German soldier over here. But the picturesque village in Switzerland wins because it wasn't in the war. We'll come back, we'll see some more of her paintings a little bit later on to continue that story. But I'm going to now move to another artist who is a kind of, well, she was a refugee. And this is Marianne von Vereften, another artist who's not, again, that well known, but is actually quite an important figure, both for her art and also for her impact, if you like, and her financial impact. I mean, she was one of the people who funded the Blaue Reiter group, which was Kandinsky and Mark and Macker and so on, and Gabriel Munter. And she was the lover and partner of Jawlensky. Now, when the war approached, she and Jawlensky split up, much to her disappointment. And she, again, was a wealthy woman, but she was a wealthy woman because of the money that came from her family's estate in Russia. And of course, when the war began, she then went back to Russia, well, in fact, went back to Lithuania. But as the war progressed, she decided to get out and then came to Switzerland and settled in Ascona, where she lived for the rest of her life. And of course, once the revolution happened, she no longer had any money and had to live by her art. She did found another group in Ascona, which is not particularly well known, but her work, I think, is interesting and quite remarkable. And this one is called A Police Post in Vilna. So obviously this is one done from her visit to Lithuania at the beginning of the war. Now this one is was painted in Switzerland, and is called, and I'll attempt a German accent here, Schneewirbel, or snow vortex. Again, really interesting painting, and you could say that she really doesn't owe anything to anyone. I mean, I suppose you could put forward the argument that there's something of symbolism there, but I think there's a kind of wildness to her work which kind of sets it apart. Interestingly, when she was young and still living in Russia, she was given the nickname of the Russian Rembrandt, which of course is very hard to see in paintings like this. And of course it was going to Germany with Jawlensky that she then became an expressionist and totally transformed her art. And here's another one of her paintings called Fantastic Night. So again, really strange, kind of, I mean, it's a very intuitive painting. I mean, I guess it's to do with feelings, isn't it? It's creating an atmosphere. Now, she was a refugee from Die Blaue Reiter group, and then there was another refugee, which was Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, from the other and arguably rival group, Die Brücke. Now, Kirchner was a very significant figure in the Die Brücke group, which was founded in Dresden, but then they moved to Berlin. Kirchner was called up into the army during the First World War, but he was psychologically completely unfit for such a thing and had a nervous breakdown, was hospitalized, spent time in sanatoria, and became addicted to morphine, and eventually settled in Switzerland, in Davos. And in fact, he spent the rest of his life in Davos. And generally speaking, when we think of Kirchner, we think of Berlin and his paintings of streetwalkers and so on, and the paintings of nudes and studio paintings. But when he moved to Switzerland, he became much more interested and involved with the landscape and really settled into the country, participated in the local community. So this painting is called Alpine Cattle Drive. And this one's in the Kunstmuseum in St. Gallen. So, I mean, given the really tortured paintings that he was doing at the end of the war, I mean, this was painted 1918-19, seems reasonably together. And I have to apologise a bit for this reproduction. It's not as good as I would have liked, but this is actually a huge painting. I think it is the biggest painting he ever did. Landscape with mountains and forests, and he was commissioned to do this as a mural for the Buchheim Museum in Bernried. And again, it's another painting that's done on sacking. It is, where are we, 236¼ inches wide. So what we're talking about, that's about being on for 20 feet, isn't it? It's a massive, massive painting. Again, utter control there. You just do have a sense from this that he loved the landscape and was well kind of embedded in it. However, his life was not totally stable. And of course, one of the things that he was keeping an eye on, because he was continuing to exhibit in Germany and continuing to visit Germany. But of course, once the Nazis came to power, then things became psychologically for him much more difficult. This one actually is prior to that. This was a woodcut that he made in 1921. It is just simply called The Tree. And I mean, it is just a wonderful example of expressionist wood cutting. Marvelous thing. I mean, it's a tree, but is it a tree? I mean, it's a kind of very strange, radiant, thorny presence. And as I said, he was involved with other people. He was not isolated, and he worked with a woman called Lisa, I'm not sure how you pronounce her surname, Gouget, I think, because she was French, but she was living also in the Davos area, and she converted some of his work into tapestry, and this is one that she made, and this one is in the Museum of Decorative Arts in Zurich. And as I mentioned, when the things were looking bad in Germany, this is his last self-portrait, which in fact he worked on over a period of about 3 years. And he committed suicide in the end in 1938. And this painting was left, we're not sure whether it was left unfinished or whether it is finished. But this is his last self-portrait. So whether I mean, it's really interesting, this kind of strange yellow diagonals running across, quite what they signify. They seem to have some connection with this figurine with her arms upraised, indicating some kind of distance perhaps between him and someone, something, some idea. And of course half of his face is obliterated. Now we're going back to Alice Bailey, and this was painted in 1917, and this is called Study for a Sonata by Dukas, and it's a portrait of Maria de Senge. So again, she was interested in music. Obviously the futurist influence was still there, and we'll show you the self. And here's a self-portrait. Now, as I said, she wanted to keep up with what was going on at the time, and this is one of her more kind of literary paintings. This is called the Strange Feast, La Fête Étrange, or Strange Festival, and it's a homage to Alain Fournier. So again, she's obviously got this, maybe there's still this lingering kind of symbolist thing going on. And this, I had to put this slide in because this is a portrait of Ferdinand Hodler's widow. Quite what he would have made of it, of course, is anybody's guess. But there she is. She seems to be coming towards us and going away from us at the same time. Again, it has a wonderful kind of lightness and humour about it. This was painted in 1918. Now, as I'm sure most of you know, in 1915 in Zurich, the Dadaists burst upon the scene, and the Cabaret Voltaire was founded, and lots of artists met there, discussed ideas, they put on exhibitions there, and they brought in work from all over. So there were exhibitions which included work by Picasso, work by the Futurists, work by Cubists, work by Expressionists. So again, the environment kind of was a sort of forcing house, really, for a kind of synthesis of modern ideas. I mean, even before the war, before the First World War, around about 1913, Apollinaire, who was the great spokesman for the avant-garde in Paris, said that there wasn't any point talking about isms anymore because there was so much kind of exchange going on between these different groups. Now, this piece is actually a kind of collage. It's wool and papers glued onto cardboard and canvas, and it's just simply called The Rhythmic Ones. So obviously, again, it's another painting about dance and movement. Now, this is where the story of Alice Bailey gets a bit sad, really. As I mentioned earlier, she became friendly with Francis Picabia, and she contributed to his notorious magazine 391, a Dada magazine. And so this was reproduced in the February edition. And this was a drawing she made, which is a kind of, is called The Beautiful Spirit of Francis Picabia. And it's a dessin ideogram, so a drawing ideogram. So we have this kind of like a sort of horse shaped, sort of like a rocking horse in here. And of course, that's a reference to Dada, which was a French baby language for a rocking horse. And we can see Picabia's name in there, Bel Esprit up here. And then there are two women dancing. One is probably Gabrielle, who is his long-suffering wife, and the other one is probably her, Alice Bailey. Now, this had a somewhat detrimental effect on Bailey's career, because in conservative Switzerland, the final manifestation of Zurich Dada didn't go down well with the haute bourgeois of Zurich, and people stopped buying Alice Bailey's paintings, and she fell into quite a deep depression, and it took several years for her to recover. And from about 1923 onwards, her work becomes much more, I guess you'd have to say, a bit more pedestrian, a bit safer. And anyway, I'll leave the story of her at that point. And now we're going to step back a little bit back to the Cabaret Voltaire. And this is the very first poster designed by Marcel Slodki, a Polish artist who was one of the Dadaists. And this is a poem by Hugo Ball, which was performed on the evening of June the 23rd in 1916, when Hugo Ball came onto the stage of the Cabaret Voltaire, dressed in a cardboard suit and a cardboard hat, and performed this poem. And there he is. So again, you can imagine the good burghers of Zurich wondering what the devil was going on here. And then we have Sophie Tauber, who later became Sophie Tauber Arp when she married Hans Arp. And here she is dancing in a Dada costume at one of the cabarets. But she was an artist, very much so in her own right, not just a dancer, and she made puppets. And this is one of her turned puppets, which this one is called the Military Guard, made in 1918. I think this actually is a reconstruction of one that she made. It's in the museum Bellerive in Zurich. And this is a portrait of Hans Arp by Sophie, but it's called Untitled Dada Head, but it's unmistakably Jean or Hans Arp. And there's some argument about whether he's Jean or whether he's Hans, because he had the misfortune or fortune, depending on how you view it, of being born in Alsace, during the period when it was part of Germany. Of course, after the First World War, it then became back as part of France. And this is one of Hans Arp's chance pieces, where he claimed that he tore up something in frustration and the bits fell down on the ground. Honestly, I don't believe a word of it, any more than I believe this declaration. I hereby declare that on February the 8th, 1916, Tristan Tzara discovered the word Dada. I was present with my 12 children when Tzara pronounced for the first time this word, which has aroused us to such legitimate enthusiasm. This took place at the Café Terrasse in Zurich, and I wore a brioche in my left nostril. I am convinced that this word has no importance and that only imbeciles and Spanish professors can be interested in dates. What interests us is the Dada spirit, and we were all Dada before the existence of Dada. The first holy virgins I painted date from 1886, when I was a few months old and amused myself by pissing graphic impressions. The morality of idiots and their belief in geniuses makes me shit. So that's Hans Arp. And now we're going to move on to something much more serious. And this is an example of a piece of work that comes under the umbrella of purism. And this piece of work that we're looking at is by Le Corbusier, who is also Swiss. He again became naturalized French, but not for a little while yet. So we're going to look at work that he produced while he was still Swiss. Now, Le Corbusier and Aux Enfants came up with this idea of purism because they felt that modern art movements were sort of spinning out of control. You know, they'd gone a bit mad. Dada was not really the way forward. Cubism had gone off the rails as far as they were concerned, and they felt that things needed to be put on a more rational basis. And so this is an example of Le Corbusier painting, which is obviously deeply indebted to Cubism, but kind of moves on maybe somewhere else, has perhaps greater solidity than perhaps we're used to seeing in a Cubist painting. Now, this is obviously what Le Corbusier is best known for, and this is his first real major piece of work. This is the Villa Savoie, which was built in Poissy, which is on the outskirts of Paris. He actually designed it with his cousin Pierre Jeanneret, and it was built between 1928 and 1931. So obviously a very uncompromising piece of modernist design. It was commissioned by Pierre and Eugénie Savoie, and they approached Le Corbusier about building a country house. The prospective site was a green field on an otherwise wooded plot of land with a magnificent view of the landscape to the northwest that matched the approach to the plot along the road. Other than an initial brief prepared by Émile for a summer house, space for cars, an extra bedroom and a caretaker's lodge, Le Corbusier had such freedom in executing the commission that he was limited only by his own architectural aesthetic. He began working on the project in September 1928. His initial ideas were ultimately manifested in the final building, though between autumn 1928 and spring in 1929 he drew up a set of alternative designs that were governed primarily by the Savoie couple's concerns regarding cost. So, and this is one of his drawings for it. Yeah, this is a perspective looking at the roof garden. So a wonderful piece of really looking to the future. Now, another artist who remained in Switzerland, are very famous, again, not terribly well known perhaps in Britain, is Max Bill. And certainly in Switzerland, he's considered to be one of the most important 20th century artists. But because I'm limiting my scope to up until 1940, I'm not going to be showing the work for which he's most famous. But because he is such an important artist, I think it is important to show really where he came from and what were his motives. And rather like Le Corbusier, he was someone who was much more of a rationalist. And he was an architect, he was an artist, he painted, he also was a typeface designer and an industrial designer and a graphic designer. And so this kind of is an example of one of his cover book designs. This is a book for you can see here, Negerkunst, so it's black art, prehistoric work from South Africa. So this is for an exhibition in Zurich. And he was also involved with the Swiss Werkbund, which was, again, an organization which brought together architects, scientists, artists, designers, and this is designed for one of their annual books. So again, really crisp, clean design. I mean, very much paralleling Bauhaus, and yeah. So, and the next. And here we have, I found this quite an amusing piece of design. This is actually for looking at medical and hospital supplies. You can see you've got the guy here in his hospital gloves, forks, and of course down in here we can see the equipment that this company is selling. And again, you could draw parallels with a lot of the design that was going on in the Soviet Union at the same period. You know, this work is not isolated. You know, he was very much part of this kind of clean design movement that was certainly Europe-wide. And now we come to Sophie Tauber art again. And this is one of her absolute abstract pieces. Now, by the time that she produced this piece, she was living in France and living with Jean Art, and she was one of the founder members of a group called Cercle et Carré, which was a group set up in Paris by Michel Souffort and Torres Garcia, and the idea really was to promote and bring together abstract artists. The group actually didn't last that long and was kind of superseded by Abstraction Création, which again Sophie Tauber Art was part of, and this is one of her, I mean, interesting pieces of design, obviously to do with balance and scale and utter simplicity. The piece itself, I think this piece is actually in the Museum of Modern Art in New York and is in gouache, but I believe she also did a silkscreen version. And the next slide is going to be my last one before the break, because this makes a natural break. And this is another artist pretty much unknown outside of Switzerland, is Leo Luppi. So that's an L-E-O, Leo, and Luppi is L-E-U-P-P-I. And again, very important artist, not necessarily because of his production. I mean, the work that he produced is not necessarily that original. He's very much a part of the circular carré kind of mentality, but he remained in Switzerland and was a leading light in a group called Alliance. And this was an important group. Again, it allowed Swiss artists to come together and collaborate in exhibitions. And it had something in common with the Berlin November Group, in that it didn't really distinguish between abstract, figurative, surrealist art. It was a way of bringing all these people together, perhaps because, again, Switzerland was a conservative country, and obviously if you've got, you know, fellow travelers that you can just about get along with, then it's better to, you know, to be with allies than to be in isolation.